Welcome. I'm Bill Etchickson, Director of the European Union of Progressive Judaism office here in Brussels. We're at the Bet Hillel IJC Synagogue, our headquarters, and we're here with Ilan Cohn, who's Director of HIAS Brussels. For the past decade or so, Ilan has been working with international organizations on the issue of helping refugees and asylum seekers. And we're here to talk about the Jewish response to that issue. Ilan, tell us really, welcome first of all, and tell us how you became involved and passionate about this subject of helping refugees.
Thank you first of all for having me. It's great to be here also with EUPJ, helping us getting started here in Brussels. That's much appreciated. For me personally, to get to where I am today, I think it was very important to first of all learn the world of international migration. So my first 20 years or so, I've really worked on international migration issues. Initially, in the Western Balkan, helping communities that had been pushed out due to the conflict in Kosovo and in Macedonia to come back to their homes after the conflict ended there. From that on, I moved into the UN High Commissioner for Refugees, the International Organization for Migration, both organizations that were really established to help European communities that were displaced during the Second World War to help them re-establishing themselves and often resettling them. From there on, at some point in the last 3 years, I ended up managing a program within the Organization of Security and Cooperation in Europe on combating anti-Semitism. And at that point, more or less, I got involved in the European Jewish community landscape, let's say, and the different community organizations that are active at the European level. And that was sort of a logical sort of transition point for me to actually work for a Jewish organization, HIAS. From that point, around the time that I finished my project in Warsaw, where I was working at the time, it's now exactly a year ago, HIAS was interested to establish an operation here in Brussels, and that's how the match came about.
Right. How did your Jewish upbringing, background play a role? Maybe in all the voyages you took or something?
I think my background is not so different from most of us European Jews. I grew up in The Hague, the Netherlands. So my grandparents from one side came from Germany to the Netherlands before the Holocaust. And I think, a lot of our identity is the identity of migrants. We have been displaced, and I think maybe that helps one, having more empathy with other people that are in a similar situation. My personal background is one of migration. I've moved probably over 20 times during the last 30, 40 years.
Yeah. No, and HIAS was started in the 1880s to help refugees, Jewish refugees, immigrants to America. It helped my great-grandfather go from Latvia, or then Russia, to Newark, New Jersey. So I feel a personal touch with HIAS. Tell me a little bit about it. What was the motivations for starting HIAS, and what are the highlights, if you had to name 2 or 3 that it's had over its more than century of existence?
So HIAS, yes, it was founded to assist Jewish refugees. Over the years, it assisted millions of Jewish refugees come, especially to North America. But we were there through all the crises that we faced over the last 140 years, whether it's during pogroms in Russia, whether it's during the world wars or the immediate aftermath of the Second World War, especially. During crisis in Cuba or Hungary, we were always there to assist Jews that needed assistance. Today, luckily there's not too many Jews that are displaced because of who they are. Still, there's many Jews that move, but often they move for a variety of motivations, and not just because of persecution. So we were in a lucky situation to basically apply our expertise in our operational capacity to assist other refugees, because they go through a very similar story. They basically have to leave their homes because of who they are. And that's, I think we can relate to it. And what we like to say is that like 140 years ago, we assisted refugees because they were Jews. Today we assist refugees because we are Jews, because we can relate to them. And on the note of the 140th year celebration next year, I hope we can do something also here in your headquarters here in Beit Hillel to mark that occasion.
Yes. Now, you've mentioned you worked in Kosovo and elsewhere. Most of the refugees there are Muslim. Does that cause certain challenges for HIAS?
I wouldn't say so. We basically help all refugees, no matter what is their religious, ethnic, national background. It doesn't matter to us. The integration of Muslim refugees is not necessarily different from the integration of other refugees. It's important to note, however, that most of our operations happen overseas. So it's not, if you think about this year, we are on course to help and assist well over 1 million displaced persons. In terms of the number of persons that we assist within our own communities, that's a tiny number in comparison to that number. Also, if you look at the number of refugees that are actually assisted to come to host countries in the West, again, that's a tiny number compared to the number of refugees and displaced persons that are hosted within the regions where they're coming from. Last year, we reached up to 80 million displaced persons. If you're looking at the number of refugees that are going to be resettled to Western countries this year, well, if you take the European Union and the United States combined, we're talking about a figure less than 50,000.
Yes. No, obviously the demand and is much greater than the willingness of the host countries these days to accept the refugees and welcome them. Let's start in the United States. What has HIAS's reaction been to the Trump administration's immigration crackdown and insistence on building walls and keeping people out?
Well, I think the Trump presidency has really had a very significant impact on U.S. immigration policy, possibly more so than any other presidency. And it goes well beyond the rhetoric against migrants of all sorts, not just refugees and asylum seekers. So when it comes to the asylum policy, first of all, it's trying to make it very difficult to claim asylum within the U.S. For example, by keeping asylum seekers in Mexico, prolonged detention in the United States, separating families, and of course, deportation as well. All these measures are all intended to prevent and send messages to potential asylum seekers: don't look for protection in the United States. That combined with a history where the United States was always a humanitarian leader when it comes to resettlement. It used to receive between 100 and 200,000 refugees every year through its U.S. resettlement program, admitting recognized refugees, especially the most vulnerable among them, in the United States. That leadership role has been abandoned, and every year since Trump came to power, that number has gone down. So next year, the determination of the cap on refugees to be admitted through the resettlement program is 15,000. This is a very historically low number compared to any year before. So that's very unfortunate, and it has an impact on the protection of refugees globally, because in any case it's a tiny number compared to the need when you consider that there's 80 million displaced people around the world. What does HIAS do in response? It's of course a very difficult environment for a civil society organization to have impact. Nevertheless, I think we are very optimistic about you know, taking opportunities to really make a difference, no matter the current policy environment. So for example, now if you go to our website today, just days before the elections, you might be participating in the US elections, you can find a lot of resources. If you're a candidate running for office, or if you're an advocate, there's a lot of resources, and we provide information how to promote candidates that welcome asylum seekers and refugees. Secondly, we also active through the legal system. So there's just now, last week, there was another step in an important court case, HIAS versus Trump, where there was an executive order that basically determines that states can determine themselves whether or not to accept the refugees that come under the US resettlement program. Another way is protesting in the street. There's a Facebook group, Jews for Refugees, with thousands of members, I see a lot of Jewish activists in the United States highly mobilized to act and go to demonstrate. For example, when there was the so-called Muslim ban, you saw overnight thousands of Jews go to demonstrate at airports around the country. I don't think you would easily see something similar in Europe, but it's impressive nevertheless.
And I think it's just a little bit over a year since a gunman broke in or fired and killed worshippers at the Tree of Life synagogue in Pittsburgh.
It's exactly 2 years. Exactly.
2 years, sorry. What was the impact of that massacre tragedy on HIAS? Did it make you more popular, less popular? Did it provoke a reaction? Because he demonized HIAS and blamed HIAS.
Yes, so before the gunman went in, he left a social media post accusing Jews, HIAS in particular, for bringing in migrants. And it's not us who brings in the refugees also through the resettlement program. It's basically the US government that brings them. I like to emphasize that, but we provide a welcome. I think the impact to some of my colleagues was quite severe, in the sense that they're suddenly much more careful in terms of how they expose themselves on social media. When you have to be more careful in terms of how you advertise your events. For example, Refugee Shabbat, that was celebrated just at that place where the attack took place. One of the 3 communities that are using that synagogue were part of the Refugee Shabbat celebration that very day. It's an event that EUPJ joins also with HIAS next year. You're sponsoring it. So I think now we wouldn't advertise all the congregations that participated to the same detail that perhaps we would do back then. In any case, we are quite a different sort of environment here in Europe, where the building that we sit right now is almost like a bunker. You have
fortress.
From the outside it looks a little bit like a bunker, but it has a lot of physical protection measures to ensure that no one who shouldn't come in comes in. We're not there anything like that in the United States, and I don't know if that's for better or for worse. It's definitely very nice to be able to express your Jewishness within the community and have religious services without, and at the same time being open to your environment. At the same time, unfortunately, we cannot do that to that same extent in Europe, and there's a reason why we have more protective measures. But in the United States, I think, unfortunately, there's a little bit of a movement towards what we see in Europe, but we are still far removed from what's happening here in Brussels.
We'll discuss that. But here in Europe also, there's a backlash against welcoming refugees. how do you find the environment and how do you judge the policies that are being followed?
Yes, I think it's unfortunate that perhaps xenophobic rhetoric, or at least populistic rhetoric, is sort of dominating the discussion around asylum and around migration. Yeah? In terms of EU policy, just in September, there was the publication of the long-expected new pact on asylum and migration. And I think the core intention to have more European coordination and more common standards around the European Union, whether it comes to asylum procedures, reception procedures, but also the external borders, cooperation with third countries, return, all of that, in principle that's a positive thing, but the very focus on, for example, the element of return, and the ability to sort of buy off solidarity, that's perhaps unfortunate. Yeah, I mean, we should still, consider that there should be open asylum system. There should be access to asylum system. They should function properly based on the minimum standards as defined in the Geneva Convention, and we should care about that very much. There's no refugee crisis at the moment in Europe. There's a refugee crisis going on globally. I think Europe can contribute towards that. It does very much so globally, also especially outside of Europe. But I think it can manage with the numbers that are coming today. There is, of course, an issue of solidarity. So when certain countries in Eastern Europe do not want to accept any refugees themselves, that's a problem, especially since there's a lot of pressure on certain Southern European countries. I used to live the last 3 years in Warsaw. It's one of the places where there's very few refugees and asylum seekers. But at the same time, when I lived there, almost whenever I used the Uber, the driver was from South Asia or from Ukraine. There's more than 1 million Ukrainians in Poland. There's thousands of South Asians coming in, every year. So again, this whole rhetoric against asylum seekers and refugees is in many cases politically driven, and we have to be mindful of that.
Yeah. What is HIAS doing now in Europe? I mean, in the past, Europe was just a place where you welcome Jews and help them get to the United States. Now, what are your activities here, particularly in Greece, for example?
So we have offices in Greece and in Austria. So the Austria office in Vienna is a long-standing resettlement operation. In Greece, we provide legal assistance and soon also mental health services to asylum seekers, refugees on Lesbos. So we were very active also after the recent fire in the Moria camp, providing humanitarian aid. Here in Brussels particularly, we are more focusing on two things. One within Europe, working with European Jewish communities. For example, I'll give you some examples of the kind of programming that we are going to do the coming year, provided that COVID-19 situation allows us to. We're working with the European Union of Jewish Students to mobilize them on our issues through placements in the field, in the HIAS field offices. We have over 70 field offices in 15 different countries, and we're trying to match them with European Jewish youth leaders. Then another example is, for example, doing activities with your own community, with the European Jewish Community Center, for example, around the festivals. Now we're starting a new project where we, together with SEGI and with colleagues in Sweden, we are Paideia. So we're going to develop resources along the major Jewish holidays to facilitate discussions around refugees and asylum seekers within the Jewish communities. And then we're going to also support Jewish communities around Europe to use those resources that are specific to the European context and translated to all the European languages and to facilitate also interface activities based on those resources. And also right now, as we are speaking, there's a call for proposals together with JDC to provide grants, small grants, to Jewish activists that care about social justice issues, and we in particular contribute to that for those Jewish activists that care about the integration of refugees or providing humanitarian assistance to refugees. And so that's something that is open for the next 10 days at least. So I call upon anyone who is listening also to look up the JDC website, Tikkun in Action, and they can find more information about that.
Okay, so you heard Tikkun in Action. You have 10 more days to put forward a proposal that would help refugees. If you have questions, please type them in the chat box and they'll be relayed to me. Thank you. I mean, getting back to Greece, where you're very active, I know you're working with a Muslim organization together. How does that work out? And how do you respond to the critics that say some of these organizations you're working with are anti-Semitic?
Okay. Not to avoid this question, but I did want to add something to the previous question. I mean, there's two elements of what we're doing here. And again, most of our work happens in countries, with the main countries that are hosting refugees. So the main thing of HIAS Europe is really to establish this organization as a major Jewish humanitarian organization, the arm of the European Jewish community at times of humanitarian crisis. So just when, for example, a Catholic community in Belgium, for example, would mobilize around a particular humanitarian crisis through Caritas Belgium, so similarly, European Jews should see us as their arm to provide leadership around certain humanitarian crises. Well, and that's why we are in Europe, in Brussels also, to connect to, for example, DG ECHO, the European Commission arm that deals with these issues. And at the moment, there's over 35 organizations of different Christian denominations. There's probably 4 or 5 Muslim organizations. There's not a single Jewish organization. We believe there should be a Jewish voice there, and within the next 2 or 3 years, we hope to have built our capacity to such an extent that we can provide leadership in that realm. Okay. Now, to your question.
I mean, I agree. The question, though, I think, is how do European Jews react to this call for action to help refugees? Are they as welcoming overall or resisting this type of humanitarian work? And then we'll get back to Greece.
No, okay. Yes. So I think there's many Jews, especially at this time of COVID-19, with many people being unemployed, many people being sick, which has a severe impact on many Jewish communities around Europe, that of course emphasize the local needs within the community. And I can fully understand that. At the same time, I think we should do more on issues outside of a community. When I look around the landscape of the European Jewish community organizations, and there's quite a few here in Brussels, almost without exception, the focus is on anti-Semitism, on Israel advocacy. Some also invest very important work around Holocaust education. There's very little attention, I think, within our community, and it's different in the United States, but I'm talking about continental Europe. Yes. It's even to some extent different in the United Kingdom. Continental Europe, there could be more of a public positioning of the Jewish community around these kind of issues. And I think there's many that are very enthusiastic about this, especially the younger generation. But I also we have there's many pensioners also that are volunteering around these issues in Greece, in Italy, in Vienna, in France, in Germany, really, in Amsterdam, and we are trying to build that network. It's true that you have to, it's not a majority, it's not a mainstream Jewish community, But there's many individual activists and some communities as well that are prioritizing these issues, and we hope that they will be able to find us in going forward.
How do you explain the part of reticence of the European Jewish communities compared to the United States, for example? Is it just a question of numbers, or a question of their own sense of either belonging or confidence in their ability to live a free and safe life here in Europe?
It's an extremely difficult question, and I'm asking myself that question as well. When I see sometimes cultural difference between European Jews, Israeli Jews, and American Jews,
Mm-hmm.
yeah, and I think our Jewish identity is of course also to some extent determined by the environment in which we live, and I think U.S. Jews are, the element of social justice within the Jewish identity seems to be very dominant. In Europe, it's also, I think, I like to believe that it's an important part of many Jewish people's identity. Within Israel, it's a very different ballgame altogether, because we are saying that we are helping Jews because it says in the Torah more than 36 times that we have to assist Jews, for we were strangers. We need to assist strangers because we were ourselves strangers,
Mm-hmm.
In the land of Egypt, more than any other commandment. So, but at the same time, I've got many religious cousins. When I was in Israel at a family event, and I was telling my cousin that that I'm working with asylum seekers and refugees. So his understanding was that I helped them leave the country, leave Israel. That was the automatic assumption. So there's many people who take these their Jewish identity and have different lessons when it comes to social justice. So it's quite a difficult issue to answer, but I'm very optimistic by what I've seen, because when I started to work on these issues, I did realize that many within the Jewish community have moved a little bit from the center left perhaps, or center towards the right on some of these issues, but I'm really very motivated by the fact that I keep encountering more and more initiatives around humanitarian issues in general, and in support of refugees in particular around Europe.
Yeah. No, and then now let's get back to Greece, where I think actually this is a global issue, the idea of partnering with Islamic organizations, and some that seem to have had an anti-Semitic strain or voices within them that have expressed anti-Semitism. How does HIAS justify that type of alliance and collaboration?
Okay. First, so I think you're referring to Islamic Relief and some board members that had expressed themselves in an anti-Semitic manner. Well, I can tell you a few things. One, when that became public, they immediately condemned any form of anti-Semitism. They completely distanced themselves from the board members in questions. The whole board resigned. And before I even read it in the newspaper, one of my colleagues in Islamic Relief reached out to apologize at a personal level, to provide support, and to express that any of these sentiments do not reflect the management, the work of Islamic Relief. So I think when you look at that very strong and bold response, of course those incidents should not have happened in the first place, and there should be better vetting procedures in place to prevent those things from happening. But the response was such that I think we can learn from that. I mean, we should see that when there is, for example, xenophobic or Islamophobic noises within our own midst, within our own community, that such a response would be similarly strong, and also in the Islamic community, if there's anti-Semitic sounds, Islamic Relief is a good sort of example how you should be responding to any form of hatred in your midst. Yeah? I think that partnership that you're referring to in Greece, I think is very innovative. It shows that two communities from different faiths, the Jewish community and the Islamic community, can come together around common values to protect and provide assistance to those most vulnerable in our midst.
Maybe explain the partnership too.
Okay.
What goes on in Greece between HIAS and Islamic Relief?
So there's the legal aid project for asylum seekers that are coming to Lesbos, and Islamic Relief USA has come together with HIAS to initiate that program, and they are still providing support. We are the ones that are implementing in the field, and I think that beyond the operational impact of having this program in place, it is also symbolic importance. As I mentioned, it shows that we stand behind common values here.
Do you think, in your own work with Islamic organizations, that each side has been learning from each other?
I think some people in Europe are, of course, concerned that Islamic refugees that come from Muslim majority countries have come up with certain ideas about Jews. We've heard that a lot also in the news, especially during times of crisis in the Middle East. What I believe, what does an asylum seeker or a refugee that receive assistance from someone that is Jewish or from a Jewish organization, what does he or she learn? Often that person had never had any contact with a Jew whatsoever. So if that person receives assistance from a Jewish organization in the field, in a refugee camp, or if that person comes to Europe and the Jewish community provides a welcoming environment by linking to educational systems and providing the initial integration, I think that can have only a positive impact. That person learns about the Jewish community, that they're perhaps not the same as he has heard before in the media, and it will only facilitate the integration of those people that are coming to Europe in the very sort of diverse fabric of our society.
How does COVID impact your operations, I guess, around the world, because it's a global pandemic?
So it's a very important and good question, because refugees have been impacted in incredible ways by COVID-19. In the initial stages also, the asylum systems basically came to a freeze. So it was very, very difficult to access protection. At the same time, in the countries where we are active, whether it's in Venezuela or in Chad, in Kenya, in Ukraine, in Mexico, so all those countries, we had to adapt, also to take care of our own personnel safety. But we have been very innovative, I must say, and services, if anything, have been expanded. There's a lot of additional programming that has gone on because of COVID and because of the needs of refugees and displaced communities around the world. So, for example, there's many refugees and asylum seekers are the first to become unemployed. They're the first to be fired, or often they're working in the gray economy. And they're not protected, and they don't have necessarily access to the same support that governments are providing to the local communities. So we've really boosted our sort of cash support to refugees, so that to support them with income. We have also adapted our counseling. So, for example, to address gender-based violence when families sit at home, for example, there's a lot of additional friction, and there's a lot of gender-based violence that has come out. And so we have intensified counseling in a safe manner either through social media, using all kinds of communication channels, and also, reaching out to the refugee communities about, of course, public safety measures.
Mm-hmm. Other questions?
Here in Europe, we unfortunately our community engagement programming, we had to basically postpone a lot of that or move it online.
Yeah, and like ours, we wanted to have refugee Shabbat in this synagogue, in this building, and we're unable to and had to cancel. So next year, hopefully. One of the viewers was saying that her family from Hungary was resettled after 1956 in the United States, thanks to HIAS. And I come across these stories all the time. We have another member, Daniel Rosas, who was resettled from the former Soviet Union in the United States and has moved back here afterwards. Google's founder, Sergey Brin, was resettled by HIAS. So your alumni are, let's say, distinguished. Is that something that HIAS is proud of, or that HIAS continues after they resettle successfully to follow and encourage?
I mean, it is, of course, important in that it provides some goodwill within the Jewish community. I was a bit worried when I started that no one in the European Jewish community would know about HIAS, because it's it's much more known, especially in the United States. One reason, perhaps a negative reason, why people in Europe have gotten to know about HIAS recently is because of the Pittsburgh attack. But also, I must say that in encounters recently, for example, in Berlin, there was someone in the Zentralrat der Juden over there that whose family was assisted to move from Iran. Then here in Brussels, the chief rabbi knows HIAS from when it was very active in Morocco. So you keep meeting people that one way or another had some exposure over the years with HIAS, and that's definitely a very helpful introduction and provides a lot of goodwill.
Well, another chapter, is Israel. And I know HIAS is actually very active in Israel, often in opposition to the Israeli government policies. Could you explain?
Well, not generally in opposition to the government policy, but when it comes to asylum policy, so Israel was, of course, among the main advocates for the current asylum regime as we know it, which came about in 1950, 1951 with the Geneva Convention, the Refugee Convention, which provide the basic standards around refugee protection that we know today. Unfortunately, there was no right to asylum before that, during the Holocaust. Those that were negotiating that global agreement, that convention, probably didn't, on the Israeli side at least, didn't foresee that Israel would become also a country of asylum for non-Jewish refugees. When it did, I think, from my perspective, and I've worked quite a bit on that issue, Israel as a Jewish country should, set a good example by adhering and promoting those very standards it had itself promoted a few decades earlier. Today, Israel faces with about 30,000 asylum seekers, mostly from Eritrea and Sudan. I must admit, it's a difficult position it finds itself in when it has it's the only democracy with a land border to Africa. That's true. But at the same time, since it built a fence, I think it was 2012, on the border with Egypt, very few cases come in every year, almost none. So when you have a static population, actually decreasing asylum-seeking population of around 30,000, I think Israel probably could cope with that. It's a good time to actually implement those same international standards within Israel. Unfortunately, when you're looking at it, when much less than 1% has actually been determined to be a refugee, has received refugee status in Israel, whereas the same populations, Eritrean asylum seekers in Europe, generally receive, over 50% depends on which country, but generally it's well over 50% recognition as a refugee, then you could probably conclude that Israel does not adhere to those very standards. I mean, we as HIAS were very much invested to partner with Israeli authorities to build up its capacity when it suddenly became an issue around 2007, 2008, 2009, when many asylum seekers came in through the border with Egypt. We were invested in build that capacity, but it didn't really exist. There was no legislation, there was no policy in place. I mean, the UNHCR was basically determining whether someone should receive protection when there was only a few hundred cases every year, but suddenly there were thousands. But when the policy was more one of forced return and detention, then we basically now, today, we are mostly focusing on partnering with Israeli civil society, with human rights advocates, with lawyers to support them in providing legal aid.
Looking forward, as we go through a winter of COVID, more pressure on refugees, elections imminent, how do you see this issue playing out in coming years? How will the world put up bigger barriers to refugees? Or do you see hope that the borders will open again and humanity will prevail?
Well, clearly, migratory pressures will increase, if anything. You know, I mean, if we're talking about Europe, so we're living in a geopolitically very unstable sort of environment. You have high youth unemployment in North Africa, in the Middle East. You have climate change pushing a lot of people from Africa, but other regions as well, to move. And that has been in our DNA, basically. Throughout centuries, we have always moved for all kinds of reasons. You know? I don't necessarily think that it should be seen as a threat. Our focus within Europe has always been on the asylum seekers. That's, of course, a tiny proportion of overall migration in and out of Europe. Overall, we need migration, and I think we should be sensitive to the urgent humanitarian needs of those that really need protection. And that's why we have the Geneva Convention. The last few years before I started the HIAS Europe office, I've been actually very much involved with efforts at the European level to combat anti-Semitism. When you look at surveys performed by a number of different organizations, you do indeed see that many Muslims in Europe have slightly higher incidences of anti-Semitic attitudes, and that can come because maybe from where they're coming, or maybe because of the Middle East, the Arab, the Israel-Palestine issue. There can be many reasons. Similarly, you see high incidences of anti-Semitic attitudes at the far right. However, if you look really at incidences, anti-Semitic incidences, you don't see very much in terms of recent arrivals, refugees having anything to do with those anti-Semitic incidents. So I think in terms of what can we do, I think the governments decide in terms of the immigration policies. But I think on behalf of the Jewish community, I think we can, if anything, we should try to promote coexistence, to promote integration. For example, by doing the type of activities that we are doing. I think if someone comes in and has never met a Jew and maybe be exposed, as you mentioned, to government propaganda that is very negative about Jews or Israel, perhaps it will be beneficial for that person's integration if he or she meets Jewish people and talk about these kind of issues.
I mean, we've partnered with you at the EUPJ, and we feel that very strongly that the progressive Judaism, its values are linked to your values, the values of welcoming the stranger and reaching out and trying to repair the Tikkun Olam, repair what's broken in the world. So that is the reason that we've wanted to engage with you and be allies and partners. And we've done a number of activities together. I'd say the Refugee Shabbat, it was a pity that it was canceled. Next year, I hope we can sit here again and say we've done it in this building, we've done it around Europe, and we'd love our communities to get involved with your activities everywhere in Europe. So, and a lot of the issues that you've talked about, know your neighbor, getting us opening the fortress and welcoming the world from outside, we're really engaged in trying to make that happen. And we've put forward in a grant application precisely to bring the largely Muslim student body from this neighborhood into the synagogue to meet a Jew for the first time. And it's a program that was developed in Amsterdam at our liberal synagogue there, and we would love to take that around Europe and work with HIAS in the same way. Maybe that type of curriculum can be worked into the refugee camps as a type of learning process too. So, I mean, I think that was the motivation for us sitting down and discussing and working together, and I hope we'll have many more opportunities. So unless there's any other questions, I think we're going to wrap up. Ilan, any last thoughts? Where would you like to be sitting a year from now, hopefully post-COVID?
Well, first of all, thank you very much to EUPJ for disseminating our resources, our initiatives. That's very important. We don't have that network of communities, so that's very much appreciated. So we will have Refugee Shabbat again, 5th and 6th of March next year. We look forward to collaborate with you on that, as well as other resources that will come out over the coming year. And we're looking for partners throughout Europe to implement that.
So you heard that. Please sign up. If you're a community, EUPJ community, please contact us and we'll put you in contact with Ilan to set up a Refugee Shabbat in your synagogue.
Post-COVID, I really hope to realize the dream of having a European Jewish humanitarian organization that is reflective also of the values of many European Jewish communities. I'm still struggling with the question of Leslie. I think what we should stand for is to basically not assume that people who come from certain countries or because of their religious background, they have certain ideas about us. I think we should provide help to those that are in need until they no longer need help. And that's our main humanitarian principle, saving lives. And I hope that more and more European Jews will seek to become active on behalf of our humanitarian mission and being able to do that, for example, through HIAS Europe.
Yeah. So thank you all for coming. I agree, Ilan. I think now that we have grown and face less persecution perhaps or less danger in our own personal lives as Jews, we need to, more than ever, step up and hold our hand open to others who are in less fortunate positions. Thank you very much. We'll be back with the next version of the EUPJ webinar talks. Hopefully, we'll schedule them about a monthly basis, and if you have ideas for guests, please send them to us too. Thanks, and have a good Sunday evening.
Shavua Tov.